Hey guys, what's going on? So welcome to my TED Talk. In today's video, I'm going to be doing something completely different. I'm stepping totally out of my comfort zone. I went back and forth as to whether or not I was going to do this video, but I talked to my wife and I decided that the time is right. In today's video, I would like to discuss my journey from basically being a lifelong atheist to becoming a person of faith. And I realize this is a very hot topic. I realize that there is a lot of content on the internet on this already. Part of the reason why I wanted to do this video was because I see a lot of circular thinking in both communities, in both the atheist community as well as in the faith communities, and it's just circular thinking. It's like two hamster wheels almost, and they're separated. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to bring these two hamster wheels together and get them spinning together. So I wanted to do this video for both Christians and for the atheists alike. I want this video to be for everybody. No matter where you're at in your faith journey, I want to speak to you specifically. This isn't to give Christians what they want to hear, and this isn't to give atheists what they want to hear. I want to kind of balance out where I've been through my journey and how I arrived at the conclusions I came to. So I was a lifelong atheist, basically. I used to think, with my knowledge of science and my belief in evolution, there was no way of coming back from that until I discovered the science about consciousness and what we actually know, and more importantly, what we don't know about consciousness. See, in my mind, I thought that consciousness, I thought we had it figured out, more or less. I thought, oh, well, we have the diagrams of the body. You know, you go to biology science class in school. Oh, yeah, here's the heart, lungs, organs. Here's the brain. Here's the hippocampus. Here's the whatever, cerebral cortex. Here's all the mechanisms of the brain. This is where language is. This is where this is. This is where long-term memory is held. This is where this, that, the other thing. I thought we knew what consciousness was, but I was conflating the brain with consciousness. So for that reason, you know, I grew up with a traditional public school education. My grandma on my mom's side is deeply religious. Both grandparents on my dad's side were both religious. Even though I was an atheist at the time, one thing that always stuck with me was my grandpa, my dad's dad, when I was little, he told me the story of when my grandpa was a little boy, when he was about 10, I think, he was working on a farm in Ohio, and he said he fell off the truck or something happened where he hit his head really hard on the ground, I think it was. The only thing that he remembers from that point was he remembers going through that tunnel. He remembers the tunnel, right, with the light at the end of it. And he said that it was so interesting hearing him tell the story, because he said that there were people, very nice people, waiting to greet him, to bring him into the light. I always thought that was so fascinating. All of a sudden, he heard his neighbor, her voice saying, "Billy, Billy, wake up. Billy, wake up." He woke up on her couch. He had been unconscious for like 8 hours on her couch. And that always stuck with me. You know what I mean? Despite being an atheist, that was one thing that I couldn't really explain away because of all these, you know, you hear tons of near-death experiences. Well, I had one in my own family, and my own grandpa, he wasn't lying to me. And then I've heard reasons for this phenomenon, right? I've heard the scientism explanation behind this, right? Which is, oh, as the brain is shutting down and as it's losing oxygen, this is just the brain's natural way of shutting down, right? That you're going to see a tunnel and there's a light at the end of it. That's a justification I used to accept. I don't accept that anymore. Too many people have had this experience, and I don't accept the linear scientific reason behind it anymore. I used to, like I said, as an atheist, I used to. I grew up lightly attending church, very lightly. My parents never forced it on me. And I have a few dings, honestly, against organized religion. For one, you know, a lot of people, a basic assumption is logically thinking, right? This is my atheist thinking brain. Religion simply evolved due to death anxiety, right? People don't want to die, they want to live forever, and they'd like to have this fanciful fantasy to believe in that they'll live forever. So there was that logical reasoning as to why faith might exist. It's because people are afraid. People are fearful of the inevitable. They don't want to die. They want to live forever. And they think that if they think that, then maybe they will, and all will be good, right? And so another thing that kept me from believing in God were how many different religions and branches within those religions existed throughout the world. If any of these faiths held the truth, they wouldn't all be at odds with each other, right? And science is so unified that it must be the truth. But both of those assumptions are wrong. First off, science is not unified, and it's not complete, and it's not comprehensive. in explaining away our existential reality. It has lots of theories, like that DNA self-formed, evolution, gravity, etc. Mind you, though, that the flat earth believers rely heavily on cherry-picked scientific data, and to be fair, religious information too. How I've reconciled the multiple religions disputes, in my mind at least, is with the rationale that they're all different because they're all varying degrees of cultural and historical interpretations, all aiming not only at the truth but giving justification for morality. Jordan Peterson once said that there's an infinite number of ways that we can interpret reality, and we have a choice in how we do it. With 8 billion people on the planet, expect wildly ranging interpretations on the matter. I might draw the analogy of competing religions to competing languages. Just because the French language exists doesn't mean that the Chinese language isn't real. They're merely different forms of communication, which are both successful at achieving their intended purpose, which is communication. Islam, Christianity, Judaism, they all perform essentially the same function, which is building a community and aiming towards the greatest moral good. While their messaging and narratives may differ, it is my belief that they evolved culturally and regionally, much like languages do, and thereby represent different cultural and religious and regional qualities. So if all these options, why Christ? Simply put, it was always there for me. In many ways, it was my only option. The country I was born in was founded on Christian values. Jordan Peterson's analysis of the ultimate logos and symbology behind Christ, as well as the historical proof that he was a real man, and through some level of prayer and following my gut instincts, are what brought me to Christ. That's not to say that there couldn't have been other prophets to one degree or another. By the way, I believe that we all could bear such a gift, or all could be called on to some capacity. But thinking in terms of one religion must be correct and all the other ones must be false is a faulty way of thinking. Much like thinking because Spanish exists, German must be a false language. Of all global religions, you'll find more parallels than contradictions between them. What we see with the differences in religions, at least by my estimation, are more so the result of cultural manifestations. Making the argument that only one of the world religions could be correct, by my view, is faulty reasoning. Another point of scrutiny that I have always had with the church, any church I've ever gone to, or any Christian or any person of faith, they tell me, well, just believe, just believe. And my problem with that approach is that I'm just too logical to just be told to just believe something. I've never conformed. I've never fallen in line with any specific ideology. I've always considered myself a free thinker. For me, personally, being told to believe something is not enough. It was never sufficient. And this just have faith, just believe approach never worked with me, not even for a second. Not even when I was 7 did that work with me. I had a lot of reasons to be skeptical of church. Let's face it, there's a ton of reasons. There's a litany of reasons to be skeptical of any organized religion. You know, a lot of the propaganda that you'll hear is, oh, look at all the pedophilia they cover up at the Vatican, right? All world religions have that problem, not just Catholicism or Christianity. It's not only there. And not to mention, whenever I was in church, I always felt like there was a lot of ego there. You know what I mean? I always felt like amongst the church members, they were all vying for power. In any group dynamic, you have people vying to become the leader, vying for power. This is constantly happening in any organized, anything, whether it be sports, whether it be a volunteer group even. Nobody's getting paid, and yet everybody wants the power. Everybody wants the authority. In any job I've been at, it's been the same dynamic. Everybody wants to advance. They want the power. And I see the same thing happening in the church. That was another reason that it turned me off to the church.
The traditions bind the community together. Now, I'm saying that, and I don't go to church, and the reason I don't go to church is because, well, it drives me crazy, to speak frankly. I haven't been able to sit in a situation like that ever since I was, well, ever, really. That's really the truth of it, ever. I'm not convinced that that's a good thing, because I do believe, and I've had good conversations about this with Jonathan Pageau, I do believe that communal return to the source of the community's ethics is actually a necessary thing. And maybe I'm atoning for my past sins by doing these biblical lectures at the moment, which is something that's communal. And then, because there's also something about going where a bunch of other people are to reaffirm your commitment to to the good that you're all aiming at that's got some power in it. And I don't think that that's something that we should forego. I think it's dangerous. I mean, look, even if you're cynical about church, and I guess I would put myself in that category, it's certainly the case that communal church going in the 1950s, say, provided the average person with at least an hour a week where they were contemplating, no matter how poorly, the purpose of ethics in life and the idea of a higher purpose and a higher meaning in life. And you got to think that spending an hour a week thinking about that is better than never doing it at all. I don't know how that tradition can be revivified in a meaningful way, but I really do think it's a catastrophe that we've lost it, because we don't have a center, an ethical center that holds our community together. And the consequence of that is that we're fragmenting quite badly.
Not to mention going to church, the few times that I did go to church, I was always confronted with dry and lukewarm sermons on morality, and it stretched on for hours, and it was just torturous. When I moved to Maryland to be with my wife a little over 10 years ago now, my wife is also deeply Christian. She's a deeply devoted Christian, and she loved me even when I was an atheist, and even when I did spit all over religion and the idea of religion. She decided she would bring us, along with some friends, to a local church called Mosaic Church, and their message is, this is the church for people that don't go to church, and it was a cool youth church. Younger people were going there, and they had coffee, and they had a cool rock show at the beginning of every session, and it was a fun place to be. People were cool, they dressed well, super friendly people. But I was expecting, since this is the church for people that don't go to church, I misinterpreted that. I thought it was the church for people who were questioning faith. But no, when I got there, it was assumed that you were just a Christian, and I wasn't that at the time. I was an atheist, and I didn't believe. For me at the time, it was just a pointless ritual. I was just going through the motions to make my wife happy. I'd been to many churches like that. I have friends, oh, come on, Dale, come to church. So I'd go and I'd entertain it, and I wanted to believe in God. Trust me, I wanted to believe, but no church ever gave me that justification to believe in a higher power. For a really long time, I wanted to believe. I had a Bible. I grew up reading the Bible, lightly here and there. I just never had a really good explanation to root myself in it. I had every reason not to, in fact. Let's look at our media, right? I watched Jurassic Park for the first time when I was like 7 or 8 years old. And that movie really shaped my scientific thinking. I'm thinking, oh my God, they took fossilized DNA from dinosaurs that they got from a mosquito that they found in fossilized amber, and they took that and they repaired it, and then they were able to make dinosaurs. And science is so cool. Evolution, obviously. And that's the other thing about evolution. To me, it's very clear, obvious. You go outside, you see different types of birds. It's clear that they're from one origin, right? You see a crow, you see a robin, you see a sparrow. It's clear to me that these are just variations of the same thing. And you could see that across every group of animal, every group of human. You can see the progression from one to the next to the next. To me, it was obvious that evolution was the single point of origin for all species on the planet. And I always found it to be kind of a cop-out, kind of an excuse that, God created all the different types of birds. It's like, he created all the different types of fish. You look at all the fish, it's like they're obviously related, they're obviously from a common ancestor, right? So the evolution theory is just so strong. So this idea that everything that came into existence 6,000 or 8,000 years ago, all the species that we have now existed because God created them all that way, I had a really, really, really hard time with that. Evolution is, to me, so self-evident that these different things living on this planet are related to one another. To me, that was so obvious. While evolution may seem self-evident, and while I do believe that it occurs on a microscale, I don't believe it's the end-all be-all comprehensive theory, as there are many anomalies that evolution cannot explain. Too many to cover in this one video. Let me just say that there are massive gaps that evolutionary theory does not account for. In a nutshell, something I also wasn't aware of when I was an atheist is that mankind appeared suddenly and seemingly out of nowhere, and the fossil record cannot account for this sudden emergence. In other words, the fossil record does not explain mankind's evolution step by step. Rather, there are some very large leaps in logic. In this clip I'm about to show, they explain how we have genes that were suddenly activated, almost seemingly intentionally. This gene activation is essentially what makes us human and what sets us apart from other species.
Genetic mapping revealed that there is only a 1.5% difference that separates us from chimpanzee. We share 60% of the same DNA with a fruit fly, 80% of the same DNA with a cow, and 90% of our DNA is the same as that of a common house cat. So the big question that comes with these kinds of revelations is simply this: if we have so much in common with other creatures genetically, then why are we so very different from them? The answer to this question goes back to an unexpected discovery made during the Human Genome Project. And the discovery is this: that a single gene can be activated in different ways and to do different things to different degrees. And what this tells us is that it's not so much about what or how many genes we have in common with the chimps or the cows or the flies. It's more about how those genes are activated, or more precisely, how they are expressed. The FOXP2 gene, for example, now understood to be directly linked to our ability to form complex speech and language. FOXP2 is shorthand for the word forkhead box protein P2, a protein that's involved in the human ability for language. Located on chromosome number 7, the FOXP2 protein is coded from a gene that has the same name, FOXP2, and is present in both humans and chimpanzees. And this fact tells us that there is something more than the gene itself that's involved here. There's something in the way the gene expresses itself that gives us the ability to consistently create the sounds of language and communication. Scientists knew from earlier research that humans and chimpanzees both possess this FOXP2 gene. They also knew that the human version of the gene changed or mutated at some point in the past, and that change happened really fast. It didn't happen slowly and gradually, as the theory of evolution would suggest. The mutation happened, quote, rapidly around the same time that language emerged in humans, end of quote. Well, this is a pivotal discovery because for the first time, the specific mutation in FOXP2 was scientifically linked to our capacity to create language. Additional studies took this research even further and determined when this particular change happened. According to Wolfgang Inard of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, the mutations in FOXP2 that make our complex language possible, quote, happened in the same time frame when modern humans evolved, end of quote. A BBC News World Edition report clarifies this relationship, and it states that our capacity for language happened when, quote, the changes to 2 single letters of the DNA code arose in the last 200,000 years of human evolution, end of quote. So the speed and the precision of the mutations in FOXP2 occurring in just the right 2 places in the DNA code are further examples of the kind of change that simply does not fit into the theory of evolution. The best science of the modern world has now given us the answer. The question now is, are we willing to accept what this DNA is telling us? Because humans are classified as the most complex and advanced member of the primate family, it was reasonable for scientists to expect that we would have more chromosomes than our less complex relatives. This is where an unexpected twist to our DNA story begins. Our nearest primate relative, as we mentioned previously, the chimpanzees, they have more chromosomes than we do, with a total of 48 in their overall genome. Ironically, humans have only 46. In other words, it looks like we're missing 2 chromosomes when we're compared to chimps. Mystery of where those chromosomes went appears to have been solved, but in doing so, however, once again, we find ourselves at the threshold of an even deeper mystery that holds even more startling implications. A closer look at our genetic map shows that what has been thought to be our missing DNA in the past isn't really missing at all. It's been with us all along, only it's been modified and rearranged in a way that wasn't obvious in the past. The second largest chromosome in the human body, forming 8% of the total DNA in our cells, human chromosome number 2, actually contains the smaller, missing chromosomes found in the chimp genome. In other words, at some point in the past, for reasons that remain controversial, 2 separate chimp chromosomes were combined into a single, larger chromosome that now is our chromosome number 2. While scientists acknowledge that the mutations definitely occurred in FOXP2 and that they happened within the time frame that correlates with the rise of the anatomically modern humans, they can't really tell us what caused that change to happen. New technology has revealed precisely what happened to create human chromosome number 2. So I'll share the discovery in 2 ways with you. First, in the scientist's own technical language, from the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, to reveal the details of the discovery itself. And then I'll describe it again with a simpler description in lay language to illustrate why this discovery is so important and what it means in our discussion. And this is a quote from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. We conclude that the locus cloned in cosmids C8.1 and C29b is the relic of an ancient telomere-to-telomere fusion and marks the point at which 2 ancestral ape chromosomes fused to give rise to chromosome number 2. I know that's a technical description, and I wanted you to hear it in the researcher's own words. The simplified explanation: it appears that long ago, 2 separate chromosomes from chimpanzees, and these were chromosomes 2A and 2B, were merged or fused into the single larger chromosome that is now our human chromosome 2. It's the key that gives us our humanness. Many of the characteristics that make us uniquely human come from this fusion. The evidence overwhelmingly suggests that, number 1, we are the result of an intentional act of some kind. Point: the mutations in FOXP2 and human chromosome 2 are precise. Point: the mutations in FOXP2 and human chromosome 2 appear to have happened quickly. Point: the optimization of human chromosome 2 that occurred after the fusion happened appears to be intentional. Point: the fact that after 150 years of searching, no physical evidence has been discovered that links us to other forms of life on the tree of primate evolution suggests that we may be a species unto ourselves with no evolutionary history. Number 2, we are the product of an intelligent form of life. Point: the timing, the precision, the accuracy of our genetic mutations, and the technology required to yield such mutations implies forethought and intention of an advanced intelligence. Point: the intelligence that carried out genetic modifications, giving us our humanness, had the advanced technology to do so 200,000 years ago in a way that we are only learning to do today. For example, DNA fusion and gene splicing. To honestly acknowledge these possibilities opens us to a paradigm that shifts the way we feel about ourselves and the way we view our place in the universe. And with this shift, we free ourselves from a lonely paradigm of insignificance to one of a rare and unique heritage that we're only beginning to explore. We're here with the bodies and the nervous systems that afford us the extraordinary abilities of compassion, empathy, sympathy, intuition, self-healing, and much more. The fact of their presence within us suggests that we're intended to utilize and master these sensitivities that we've arrived with. From the time of our origin, we have been wired for these extraordinary abilities. This design affords us extraordinary ways of living and extraordinary lives. The question that immediately comes to mind when we consider that we've had such advanced characteristics from the time of our beginning is simply this. How do we fully awaken these capabilities in our lives today? What do they mean to us? I invite you to share a journey of discovery in which we will do our very best to answer not only this question, but to explore the deepest truths of our new human story.
I want to make it clear that I completely understand atheism. I understand how they think. I understand why they think the things they think. I understand all their arguments. They always have an answer to everything, just like a flat earther will. There's always an answer, just like a person of faith will. They'll always have an answer. Will the reasoning that they provide to you make sense to you, and will you believe them? Right? These are all different things. So I want to get to the part to where I actually started to come out of atheism. In 2017, I started listening very heavily to atheism podcasts. I was fascinated, right? The Jonestown cult. I was fascinated by cults. I was fascinated by these people that they get into groups, sometimes dangerous groups, how they'd get recruited, how they'd get brainwashed by the group. I've always been fascinated by that, by brainwashing, how it happens, how you get to control an entire group of people. The worst part, honestly, like in the case of the Jonestown cult, how you convince parents to subject your kids to a suicide cult. To me, that's just the sickest thing I could ever imagine. I don't know how you bring a human to the point to where they believe these things, and they're willing to participate in these things. I just don't get it. But then again, I've always been kind of an outsider. I've always retreated back to myself for internal contemplation. I've never done well in groups. I love people, but I don't do well in a group dynamic, especially not in the long term. I never stuck around with sports for very long. I only went to school because, frankly, I had to. I was always a bit of a social outcast, and so for that reason, I found respite and solace in being alone, being introverted. Believe it or not, I'm quite introverted. It might not come off that way. I actually learned how to love people and how to love communicating with people. So I'm both an extrovert and an introvert. Maybe we all are. We're just along a spectrum, extroverted to introverted, but I need my quiet time at the end of the day. I cherish it. I love it. I just need time where I'm not interacting with people and just to get centered and refocus, reorient myself. So I was listening. I grew very fascinated with studying cults. And to one degree or another, we're all in cults. Let's be honest. We all are. If you religiously watch Star Wars, guess what? You're in a cult.
I take your reading of Christianity to be, for example, compatible with Star Wars in the sense that Luke Skywalker is a very quirky, odd guy, in the middle of this random planet.
Of course.
Who's just as weird and odd as a carpenter in Galloway, right? And yet he is the embodiment of this kind of eternal spiritual thing, and that's where you get that kind of melding together.
Right. In Star Wars, we should just look at it historically. Star Wars, George Lucas, Joseph Campbell, Carl Jung, because all of Campbell's thinking was Jungian thinking, all of it. And The Hero with a Thousand Faces is a great book, especially as an introduction to that kind of literature. But yeah, Star Wars is Christianity for atheist nerds.
Yes.
Fundamentally, yeah.
Yes,
and you can't get rid of that. There's no getting rid of that, right? If you throw it out in one direction, it comes back in another. And that's something we should talk about too.
Well, it's a very powerful story. Yeah, no, absolutely. The one thing I would want to say, though, is that we are most happy when we do not perceive ourselves as inheriting an archetypal story from somebody else. If I were to say to you, here's the archetypal story, you're going to end up back there, that would be disinteresting to us emotionally. We want to tell our own stories. We want to be particular in ourselves. I would also say that even though human psychology has remained relatively constant for at least 300,000 years, and parts of it for over 1 million, our world is changing and has changed. And there are real differences between the way the world works now, the kinds of actions and behaviors that are going to function now than there was even 500 years ago. And so there is this need for flexibility in narrative. So even as what you're talking about, I think, Jordan, is this fundamental spiritual component of narrative, the way in which narrative can connect us with the eternal, a sense of things bigger than ourselves, and that transcendent sense of purpose is what lifts us. But narrative also has this flexibility outside the spiritual, in the material world, to say, okay, how do I navigate this challenge?
If you have to tune into sports every single week and follow that super closely, to one degree or another, again, with the spectrum thing, there's nothing wrong per se with being in a group and being in an interest group and being in a group of friends, a work group or a study group. There's nothing wrong with this. Humans, we're dynamic creatures and we have social dynamics, and sometimes these dynamics spiral out of control. So I got really fascinated into studying about Scientology and atheism. Like I said, some of these death cults, I went through and I listened to just tons and tons of testimonies, people that were in cults that broke out. There's still a lot of cults in the world. The point being is cults emerge everywhere. Everywhere humans are, cults emerge, groups emerge. And cult and group, there is a differentiation. And so what I was getting at there was I started listening to several channels on YouTube. I unsubscribed, so I don't even remember the name of the channel, but the one channel was, the kid was a Jehovah's Witness, and he broke free of that faith. He started to expose all the hypocrisy and all the wrongdoings and how they treated him very badly in that group. And then he started his own podcast on YouTube. It's very successful. He's interviewed tons and tons of people from different faiths that also broke free and exposed like the cult-like nature of these different faiths. And so I was all into that, and I was all into listening to the atheist podcasts, and I'd listen, and people of faith would call in and have a debate with the atheists, and it seemed like to me the atheists were always winning. They were frankly trumping the Christians and the people of faith that would call in. And so I was just all on board with the atheism, and let's face it, there are a lot of reasons to be skeptical of groups of people, cults, if you will. There's so many reasons to be skeptical, so many accounts. But this is, once again, this is man corrupting. Man is corrupt, and man corrupts really any institution, any group that they become part of, right? And that's part of being a Christian, is understanding that we're all fallible beings, we're all weak, we're all imperfect. And so for that reason, we see all kinds of corruption emerging in any group. Let's take faith out of it. Any group, corruption emerges, right? So I wanted to put that into perspective. Not to mention, I'm very familiar with it's a scientific model, actually. It's called the BITE model, B-I-T-E. It stands for, and it's a scale, right? It's a gradient scale. And basically 4 categories. You have behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. All 4 of these categories get ranked, and then you could sort of from there assess the severity of the cult mentality in any given group, right? Scientologists, for example, they wouldn't let you be exposed to certain information at all. They just cut you off from it. To me, that's a clear red flag. Like, I don't like being told that I can't access certain public information, books. But yeah, the emotional control in Scientology, for example, they're very big on the emotional control and the information control and the thought control. In Scientology, they have what's called auditing sessions, where you basically sit down with an auditor and they listen to all kinds of things about that. But it's basically a therapy session to make them confess everything. They also build a huge file on you. There's a really good show on Hulu. The show is called The Path. I watched that. But basically, every member of the religion, they build a huge file on them. So from these auditing sessions, they take all that information that you divulge and they keep it. And it's basically blackmail. So if you ever leave the group, they can hold that over you because you've confessed every wrongdoing that you ever did. And so they have all this blackmail on you, essentially. Is that healthy? I don't think that's very healthy. And so I wanted to lay the groundwork because I was strong into science. I was strong into understanding the hypocrisy behind these different religious groups. But now I want to talk about where I started to turn around. So because I followed the Atheist Experience on YouTube, one of the key members on that podcast is a guy named Matt Dillahunty. And I listened to him and I thought he was really good. I thought he was awesome. And so then out of nowhere, I saw Matt Dillahunty debating Jordan Peterson. It was a live stage debate, and Jordan Peterson was arguing for the rationale behind having faith, and Matt Dillahunty did what he always does, arguing for the atheist belief system. So during that debate, I listened to it, and I could tell the audience was mostly comprised of atheists because they were cheering on Matt Dillahunty. I was too. I walked into that cheering on Matt Dillahunty, but being open-minded, I knew I had to listen to what Jordan Peterson had to say. And I didn't really know much about Jordan Peterson at the time. But during that debate, Jordan Peterson said one thing that really I could not get past. And I'm going to play that right now.
Right, but that's exactly my point.
Yeah, that's all I was going for.
You can make a case that consciousness isn't exactly in your head either, even though it's localized there.
So why would I think consciousness is anywhere other than my head?
Well, how do you account for consciousness?
Well, I'm not sure that we can account for consciousness.
This is definitely true.
But
yes. See, and that's
I have
another
no reason to think
well,
that it's beyond, what the brain produces. The fact that something's mysterious doesn't mean that, well, if something's mysterious...
Consciousness isn't just mysterious. It's like really mysterious. It's the most mysterious thing.
Okay, well,
right?
the fact that...
It's not like ordinary mysterious.
So, a little bit about Jordan Peterson. I'm sure most of my audience knows who he is. Jordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist. He's a scientist. He's been doing this his entire career. He's a brain expert. He's supposed to know what the brain is, what consciousness is. I thought we had that ironed out. I thought we knew what consciousness was. It's in the brain, right? It's that linear materialist train of thought that when you belong to the scientism faith, or when you're thinking in terms of scientism, you would think that we had the brain figured out and we had consciousness figured out. But during that interview, when he said that consciousness is the strangest phenomenon that we're aware of, I couldn't get over that. He's, once again, this is a clinical psychologist. He spent his career analyzing and studying the human mind. If he's still mystified by consciousness, then that speaks volumes to me, personally. I thought, this is a real scientist, and he didn't admit to being a man of faith, but mind you, he wasn't arguing for Christianity or anything like that. He was simply arguing morals, ethics, and the phenomenon of the human mind. So their debate ended, and then another thing didn't quite sit well with me after that. So the next day, Matt Dillahunty posted a video on his YouTube channel bragging about his performance against Jordan Peterson, and I'm thinking, that's not a very gentlemanly thing to do. That's not a very humble thing to do.
Reflections on my conversation with Dr. Jordan Peterson. You can go watch this event. I thoroughly enjoyed it and am pretty proud of what happened.
That's a very egotistical thing to do, I thought. It's just something about that just left a really bad taste in my mouth. I'm like, why would you make a video the next day congratulating yourself on your performance against Jordan Peterson? As if he won the debate. In his mind, he's thinking, oh yeah, I won. It was obvious to me at that point that he was only concerned with his ego. And I went and watched that debate many, many times again, and I've started to pick up on some body language between both gentlemen. You know what Jordan Peterson didn't do the next day? He didn't go bragging the next day. In fact, I've never seen Jordan Peterson brag. He's always incredibly humble, despite the fact that he has hundreds of millions of fans, right? He didn't release a video the next day congratulating himself. He didn't do that. I just thought that was really kind of low of Matt Dillahunty. Not to mention, when you go back and you analyze their body language, Jordan Peterson is a very loving man. He takes the other person very seriously. He takes everything that they have to say with full respect. He never takes a dig at his opponent. Matt Dillahunty, on the other hand, he was aiming the whole time for gotchas. He was trying to get Jordan Peterson.
When my lawnmower acts up, I will sometimes anthropomorphically, cuss it out.
Yeah, it's hard to get rid of those vestiges of religious behavior.
But, yeah, it is. Although at least I got rid of them.
I haven't seen you interact with your lawnmower yet.
That also rubbed me the wrong way. Because Matt Dillahunty, at his core, and when you look at his body language and when you look at his face, you could see the lack of confidence in his face. He's got those big eyes that they just look like they're filled with self-consciousness and fear and worry that he's not going to win. He's not going to win the debate. It was clear to me that Matt Dillahunty was just there to win, whereas Jordan Peterson was there to actually have a conversation. So yeah, I could see the fear in Dillahunty's face because his entire self-worth is wrapped up in his atheist reputation, and he's very worried about that reputation and defending it in front of his audience, whereas Jordan Peterson did not have that demeanor about him whatsoever. And so that really caused, I saw a lot of self-doubt in Dillahunty's face. He was a man of faith who left the Southern Baptist Church to become an atheist. Once again, his performance I was not impressed with. I think when it comes to a debate, just me personally, I think you should present your ideas. It should be a gentleman's exchange. You can both add something to the conversation and walk away. To me, I place a lot of value on humility and the ability to not be so adversarial, not trying to win, not trying to get you with gotcha statements. And that's what Dillahunty did the entire time. So I want to go through the process. So I finished watching that debate the first time, and I started looking into consciousness because I didn't know that we didn't know what it was. I thought we had that figured out. For about a month, I started looking into it, and there's actually a lot of physicists who study consciousness who are trying to get to the bottom of it. They still haven't, obviously. Over the course of the month, a full month of really thinking about this really, really hard, I didn't know this. I didn't know that consciousness was the most mysterious phenomenon in the universe. I thought there were other things way more mysterious than that. But there isn't. Consciousness is the most mysterious phenomenon in the universe. Like, think about that for a second. And a clinical psychologist doesn't know what it is. A scientist can't tell you what consciousness is. To me, that just spoke volumes. It upended my entire epistemological approach to contemplating this existence. That was the smoking gun right there. That was the shot heard around the world for me. So for about a month, I really contemplated it, and I was still an atheist after I listened to that podcast. It's not like my brain was automatically switched. And this is how this thing is supposed to go, right? I don't think your thoughts should change based off one exchange. I think you need to really internalize this stuff, and that's what I did. I really internalized the consciousness thing. That was the seed that Jordan Peterson planted in my brain that sprouted. It started to sprout slowly, and then it grew, right? Just like a seed. And that's science, by the way. So to kind of add veracity to this, I want to talk about string theory. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I'm a physicist or anything like that, or a physics expert. String theory is something that we know. You could go read about it. Essentially what it is you have the same atom existing twice in the same time frame. So essentially, if you manipulate one atom, then the other one is manipulated as well. In real time, by the way. It doesn't matter the distance. So in other words, the theory is that these two atoms are strung together, metaphysically speaking, and when you manipulate one, you manipulate the other one, and this is in real time. This is faster than the speed of light, which speed of light, nature's speed limit, you shouldn't be able to exceed the speed of light. But you could have, if two atoms are strung together, or two particles, or whatever, doesn't matter the distance. It could be on the other end of the universe, and if you manipulate one, the other one is instantaneously manipulated. So this has been proven. This is proven. In fact, Einstein referred to this phenomenon as spooky science. So take that idea of string theory and then relate that to consciousness, right? Because if you have the same matter in two different locations in the same time, what's stopping us from pursuing the idea that the mind may operate in a similar fashion? In fact, Jordan Peterson also said, and I've heard this repeated many times, many physicists and many very highly credentialed people say that the more they study the brain, the more they study consciousness, it starts to look like the brain is not the progenitor or the producer of consciousness. Rather, it looks like the brain is the receiver of it.
There is a scientific revolution going on now about the mind-brain discussion, the relationship between the two, that is extraordinary. And I think it's going to lead to a complete shift in our worldview that is unprecedented. And this living in a mindful universe is really about that scientific revolution.
Are you discounting whether the brain controls consciousness?
No, I think what we would say is the brain is a reducing valve or filter that allows primordial consciousness in. That is, the brain is not the creator of it. You cannot explain all of the details of human experience, especially all the evidence for non-local consciousness, the evidence for things like reincarnation, past life memories in children, indicative of reincarnation, things like that, if you think the brain is the producer of consciousness.
So what is the producer?
Consciousness is what exists and generates the entire universe. It's the
So this is
fundamental
my
ground state.
consciousness now, right?
It's all consciousness. It's all generated within consciousness. I mean, the thing to remember is we're under what we call the supreme illusion, and that is that the brain and mind are very good at convincing us that all this stuff around us is out there. But what you're actually experiencing is a model deep within mind that is supposed to represent something that is out there. But I think that's where it's important to point out the mystery of quantum physics, because the experiments in quantum physics keep showing us in no uncertain terms that consciousness is fundamental. The conscious observer and our free will has everything to do with determining outcomes. It's not determined by mechanistic chemical reactions and the laws of physics and chemistry applied to the brain.
Doesn't it almost destroy everything you learned?
Absolutely not. In fact, it opens the door to a far broader understanding. Because what we're saying is the brain is simply a reducing valve that allows certain conscious states to exist. And this is where, from the quantum physical standpoint, it's really getting at what's known as the observer. That is the deep mystery, is the awareness of existence. And what I would submit is that we're conscious in spite of our brain. And so, in fact, the big surprise and kind of the practical lesson for human beings is that when your physical brain and body die, your conscious awareness actually expands tremendously.
Now, link this back to string theory. What if, now I'm just speculating here, this is just conjecture. What if the phenomenon of consciousness that's happening in your brain, you could have the same piece of matter exist twice within the same reality? Beyond a shadow of a doubt, this is happening. What if our consciousness is also related in some way to string theory? What if consciousness itself is a non-local phenomenon? What if the source of the consciousness is somewhere else? By the way, this is real science. I'm not just spouting this off.
Back to our previous discussion of Sperry, it sounded like he was still what we'd call an epiphenomenalist, that the brain produces the mind, and then the mind, having been produced by the brain, has a mind of its own.
Exactly. He's only going that far instead of saying it's actually separate.
But Eccles seems to be, as a dualist, is saying there is a realm of consciousness completely independent of the physical body. And at that point, we begin to see the brain not so much as the manufacturer of consciousness, like the philosopher John Searle would say, the brain produces consciousness like the stomach produces digestion.
Yes.
Eccles and others who are dualists would say maybe the brain is the receiver of consciousness, like a radio receiver.
Exactly. And I think that is a beautiful analogy that has been used way back from the time of people in the 1800s, for example, William James. That was a beautiful analogy that I think still holds very well, that perhaps you have this non-local consciousness and the brain is receiving information from that non-local consciousness, which could be, again, your own mind, but perhaps other people's minds as well in the universe. And you receive that creative information. It comes into your local consciousness of your mind and then down to affect your brain.
So the brain acts as a filter.
Definitely. And what's interesting to me is here, in fact, what you were just saying is that many materialists might also understand the idea of filtering. That's absolutely the case. And when I was a young graduate student and we were talking about how it is that we have this incredible amount of information flooding our senses, visual information, auditory information, etc., how is it that I only really see you and I don't see all the other things that are coming in, flooding my senses? And the point is that they believe our nervous system has to filter this information for us to be able to make sense of our universe. And for me to be really talking to you in a very coherent way without letting all this other stuff distract me.
Well, you've pointed out in previous interviews the experience of non-local awareness, which is like infinite, that you have a sense, I gather, you might feel like experiencing the whole universe at one moment.
That is true. And I think we hear that from great sages of various traditions, that they have had this experience. I think that they also say that simultaneously they can be functioning at the local level, interacting in their filtered way with the people around them very effectively. In fact, I've heard some of the people who talk about these sages say that they typically are not in a thinking mode when they don't need to be, but then they go right back into their more local contracted consciousness when they need to be, of having that filtered awareness.
In other words, while this contracted consciousness seems to be pretty useful for driving your car, tying your shoelaces, and all the things that we have to do in the physical world, the brain might be capable of much more than that.
Exactly. And I think that what they're actually saying is that when we quiet our thoughts down, which are, in a certain sense, our filters so that keep us from seeing very many things, it's when the thoughts are minimal that we can actually expand and experience much more creativity, much more information from perhaps a non-local realm that actually can improve the outcome of whatever we're thinking about or planning.
Yeah. So now we've just discussed a couple of Nobel scientists who are talking about the causal role of mind or consciousness.
Right.
As a neuroscientist yourself, is there any reason based on the data of neuroscience to object to that worldview?
And absolutely there is. And that's the neuroscientists, I think, tend to look at what they have found so far in neuroscience. And I should say, again, when I was a young graduate student, I read all of these studies that showed that when you actually have an injury to the brain, you lose particular functions. And I talk in my book about different aspects of that. One particular man who had a stroke, and in the stroke to one part of his brain, he lost his ability to even be aware of objects on the opposite side of his body because of that stroke. So he lost all attentional awareness. And in fact, the only way that he could eat in the morning and eat all of the food on his plate was for his wife to rotate the plate around after he'd eaten the food, just for example, on the right side of the plate. And when he was an artist, and when he would actually do paintings after the stroke, he was only painting one particular part of the canvas because he couldn't even be aware of the other particular part of the canvas. So the neuroscientists say, hey, look at this. This means that our brain produces our attentional awareness, our consciousness, our reality. And of course, other neuroscientists have shown examples of people that have a lesion in their parietal lobe, which is the area where we bind information together in our brain. And they say when a person has a tumor that grows there, they can no longer see the entire picture in front of them, for example, you in front of me as one whole, but they only see, for example, your eyes or your nose or your ears, and they're always having their eyes dash from one place to another, trying to figure out how it goes together. So they say, clearly, it's your brain that's producing the binding of your whole awareness together.
So we must have, at this point, a lot of data regarding injuries to the brain and how that affects behavior and awareness.
Right. And I think the beautiful thing that the people who are saying, wait a minute, their brain is a receiver and or a transmitter are saying is that actually that analogy may be true in a certain sense, and that if you break the brain, you're no longer going to be able to receive the information from outside or transmit it. But just like radios and televisions, that doesn't mean there isn't something that you are actually receiving. It doesn't mean that all of that information is inside the television or the radio. It just means that the receiving mechanism is broken. And so I think that's where the neuroscientist's analogy doesn't really work so well. They have to really look beyond just being a producer of this activity inside the brain.
But we've seen a lot of paranormal things be confirmed in our media recently. Look at the UAP phenomenon. Various news outlets are now reporting on it. It's a real phenomenon. It's real. It's really happening. There's stuff in our skies. We don't know what they are. The UAP phenomenon, I listen to Dr. Stephen Greer a lot too, and I know he's controversial, but he says that ultimately the root of the UAP phenomenon is also consciousness. UAP, UFO phenomenon, whatever terminology you want to use, the root of it is also consciousness. And he says that essentially these craft are able to maneuver in ways inexplicable by our linear materialist physics paradigm. He says that essentially at the root of the UAP phenomenon is also consciousness. If one of the craziest things that we can observe in our atmosphere at its root is also consciousness, you start to think of, if we see these UAPs as like such advanced technology, you start to realize that our consciousness itself might be an advanced technology, right? I was watching a podcast recently about that, and somebody asked the question, I found this very profound. If you wanted to create something that would still be there in a million years for whatever civilization, if you wanted to create something for them to observe that would still be there for after a million years, what would it be? The kid, who I believe is a physicist, replied, oh, I'd take some whatever metamaterial and put it in rotation around the earth in a pod, and so that it would be there, you know, for millions and millions of years. Hopefully nothing would impede it. And the speaker said, well, if I wanted to create something that would be here in a million years, you know what I would create? He said, DNA. And I thought, wow, That is profound. DNA. And he's right, because DNA is self-replicating, right? You think about life on this planet, the design to it, right? If you wanted to create something that will be here in a million years, you create DNA. You know, every living organism contains DNA. And that just rocked my paradigm again. Like, something had to create DNA. DNA is also a technology. I've started to think of DNA and consciousness as technologies, basically. You know, we have a lot of advanced technology now, but the more I start to know and understand about how things work, the more I'm arriving at the conclusion that not just DNA is a technology, but also consciousness itself is a very, very advanced of technology. We wield it every day with no idea how it works.
So Don, from a scientist's perspective, how do you put that in your model? I mean, this idea that the mind can actually cause physical manifestations.
Well, I agree with Suzanne that I found a lot of so-called top-down influences, that you're building models, in the case of visual perception, for example, you're not just simply taking a picture of what's out there, you're actually building models and you're using the data that's coming in through your senses to refine your models. But in neural terms, the pathways that just feed forward the data from the eyes up to the brain are actually smaller than the top-down feedback pathways. They're even bigger. There's the whole field of predictive coding, where we're making these models, we're predicting what we should see, and then we're just checking against the little data that's coming in. And there's another level of this, though, and that is we do have clean evidence, except in some of the cases you're talking about, that there are clean correlations between neural activity and our conscious experiences. Although in some of these cases you're showing that the neurobiology says one thing and the conscious experience is something else. But there are all these correlations, and researchers in my field look at those correlations. We call them the neural correlates of consciousness. We're trying to look for the neural correlates of various kinds of conscious experiences. There's lots of them. The old adage, correlation doesn't imply causation, definitely applies here. You know, just because a bunch of people show up at a bus station and a bus shows up doesn't mean that the people caused the bus to show up there. There was something deeper, namely a bus schedule that caused both to show up there. And so when we have these correlations between brain activity and conscious experiences, most of my colleagues think that the brain activity causes the conscious experiences. The reason why I've been looking at this evolutionary stuff and showing that we haven't evolved to see reality as it is because it has an important implication. It means that the very predicates, the very language of space and time and physical objects is the wrong language to describe whatever the true cause and effect of reality might be. It's the wrong language. So we have in everyday life the fiction of causality. It seems like my right hand caused my left hand to move. And that's a useful fiction within our user interface. But it's just a fiction. Just like if you drag your icon to the trash can, you might say, well, the movement of the icon to the trash can caused the file to be deleted. And that's fine. That's a nice fiction for the user interface, but it's strictly speaking false. The icon moving on the desktop did nothing. There's no feedback from that into the computer. So we have all these correlations between neural activity and conscious experiences, and I've concluded the reason we can't figure out how brain activity causes conscious experience is because it doesn't.
Doesn't there have to be something that causes conscious experience?
Something deeper has to cause both our experience of the brain and the experience of the other conscious experiences that we have.
What's that something that's deeper?
Well, what I'm working on is an idea that consciousness itself, along the lines you were talking about, the consciousness itself is fundamental. And to make that a scientific theory, I've had to develop, and I've published a couple papers with some colleagues, on a mathematically precise theory of consciousness. And it's mathematically precise not because I think I'm right. I'm probably wrong. But the point is to be absolutely precise so that we can figure out where we're wrong. And that's sort of the spirit of science, is absolute precision in what you're claiming so that you or others can figure out where you're wrong, and that's how you get things going.
So when you say your theory is that consciousness is fundamental, in other words, it can't be reduced to something. It can't be reduced to, I suppose, the stuff of physics, right?
That's right.
You're saying it's outside the whole world of matter, of particles. It's something else?
That's right. So it's every scientific theory makes certain assumptions. It says, please, if you're a physicalist, you might say, grant me space and time and, neutrons and protons and electrons. And if you grant me that, then I'll explain chemistry and biology and even psychology and consciousness. And what I'm saying is those are the wrong things to start with. space-time and physical stuff are the wrong starting point. Let's start with conscious experiences, like the taste of chocolate, the smell of garlic, and so forth. Start with consciousness, have a mathematically precise theory of that, and then show from that foundation how space-time and physics comes out as a user interface that certain consciousnesses use as they interact with other consciousnesses. So it's a very different kind of approach. And
do many people agree with you on this?
Oh, very, very few. Only my graduate students.
Not to get too woo-woo with all this, but there's a lot of really good evidence to indicate that there's some truth to remote viewing, i.e. using your consciousness to travel and to observe things. And a lot of people participate in it. I've never tried it personally.
Theoretically, remote viewing is using the mind's eye alone to observe and acquire direct information of locations, objects, and events that are blocked from ordinary means of perception.
If you start looking into remote viewing, psychic abilities, there's a lot of very valid and compelling information out there. I could leave some links in the description below if you're interested in remote viewing. Mr. Mythos did a really good and objective video on remote viewing. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Non-local consciousness is basically remote viewing. It's alleged that you can take your consciousness and leave your body, go explore around. And apparently that's boundless as well. You can go anywhere, apparently, with your consciousness. And also, the more that I study about DNA, the idea that DNA could form by chance, like I understand, okay, yeah, I've heard the theory that the first molecule of DNA formed by chance in the oceans when the Earth was barren, there was no life on it. The more I start to understand about DNA and how complex it is, the more I'm starting to find that idea that some DNA just materialized out of nothing is frankly ridiculous. I don't buy that anymore. That is not a good argument whatsoever. They claim that they were able to see DNA start to form itself in a lab under certain conditions. I'm sorry, I have yet to be convinced of that. I do not buy that at all anymore. I used to think that was true. I used to think it was unlikely, but true.
Well, so today we're talking about your journey from atheism all the way to Christianity. Your background is in, what is it, biochemistry. Your background as a scientist, but that's actually what led you to embrace God's existence and then eventually to become a Christian.
When you're a chemistry major, you also have to learn some physics. So I was learning things about quantum mechanics and things in physics that seemed a little strange to me, but I didn't really worry about it too much. And then eventually I decided I really wanted to study life. And rather than be a biologist, I wanted to study the chemistry of life. So I went into biochemistry, where I got my PhD. Even in college, as a young man, I began to feel there was something missing in my life. And I later realized it was some sense of spirituality, which I think is very important for all people. But I found that, whatever that you want to call that, in science. Science is great because it gives you a real sense of purpose, a real sense of doing something good in the world, and it's true, so it's great. But there was one catch, which was that what I was learning in science didn't jibe with the materialistic worldview. And I couldn't have said it that way. I just felt it. In graduate school, I learned about the process by which proteins are made in cells. And that's a very complex process that involves a tremendous amount of biomolecules interacting with each other. And the complexity is just incredible. And I remember feeling like a chill going down my spine. It was like, this is amazing. How did this get here? And it was something that I couldn't answer. Later, of course, like most biologists, I just came up with the answer, which is evolution. Evolution does everything. At that time, I kind of left things as it was. I just started wondering about really whether science was really the only way to find any truth. Pretty soon I rejected that, as many people have. I was not yet ready to believe in God, and that took a lot of other steps. It required me to kind of break down my resistance to the idea, which I was born with. And it's kind of hard to, reject all of that. But eventually I did, because the science I was learning did not support a strict atheism. It did not support strict materialism.
Okay.
And that comes from quantum theory, and it comes from, the observer effect and all sorts of things in physics, but it also came from what I was learning in biochemistry and about how life works.
Right.
It just seemed that saying evolution explains everything in life was too glib. You know, it was too easy.
That's interesting because I've heard a lot of scientists, even like Peter Atkins, will say that God is like a lazy explanation. And you're saying that evolution is kind of like a lazy explanation.
Well, at that time, I would have said God was a lazy explanation too. I had no idea what the explanation was. I didn't really know what God was. I didn't understand very much about God. I think evolution can explain a lot, but there are some key things that it cannot explain, and that includes the origin of life. And that's not my view. That's a very... Darwin said the same thing. Richard Dawkins has said the same thing.
Yeah.
The process of evolution that we call Darwinian evolution or biological evolution doesn't deal with the origin of life at all. Abiogenesis is a very active field of research. Abiogenesis, nobody thinks that it has anything to do with, you know, standard evolution. The general scientific idea is that life began through what's called chemical evolution. And chemical evolution is very different from biological evolution because there's no natural selection. There's no replication.
There's no mutations.
Chemical evolution is when you take chemicals, you put them together, and they either react or they somehow are able to do things only on the basis of chemistry, without any mutation, without any replication, and without any natural selection. And that's pretty hard to do. Jim Tour, who's in this neighborhood, has often said quite strongly and correctly that people who say that we've solved so many problems in abiogenesis, we're almost there, are just wrong. Life does things because of natural selection, perhaps, or because of, you know, the way life works, and you can get evolution, but you can't get it started, especially related to one of my interests, which is how the DNA works by coding the existence of proteins which cause life. But I was focusing on one specific aspect which is critical to the origin of life, to the origin of evolution, and that is the accuracy of self-replication, because nothing in the universe self-replicates accurately other than living cells. No chemical self-replicates, no machine self-replicates. Crystals don't self-replicate. Even DNA doesn't self-replicate. But a living cell can make copies of itself that are 99.9999% accurate. That's astonishing. How does that happen? It involves a tremendous number of really complex things, including the genetic code, including ribosomes and DNA replication and protein synthesis, things that are just too complicated to describe without slides. If you have to have self-replication in order to have evolution, how do you get all this? How did that self-replication get there?
Yeah.
It couldn't have evolved because there's no evolution. There are thresholds. And if you don't start out with a cell that already is pretty good at accurate self-replication, you can't do it. You'll never get living cells and you'll never get evolution going.
You've got to get the cell first in order to get it up and going and get any evolution. Right. But then to get to that point, to get to the first cell, you need just too many things. Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, you need too many things that are too difficult to explain through only chemical evolution.
What is the current consensus? Is that what's the current scientific consensus about abiogenesis?
It depends who you talk to. If you talk to people who are not working in the field, many of them will say, "Oh yeah, we're getting there. We've got made a lot of progress. We know that amino acids, were in meteors, so they probably were formed in the primordial Earth." Leaders in this field, know the details, and the details are exactly what Jim Tour says. It doesn't happen. You don't get long polymers. You get short polymers. You don't get self-replication. You get annealing. You get junk rather than good stuff. That's what they know. And frankly, I think many of them are getting discouraged. It looks like not a lot of progress has been made. Darwinian evolution by natural selection explains why we have morality, or explains why we're creative, or we love music. That's just nonsense. That's not even scientific. Those are stories, okay? So what makes us human? What does it mean to be in the image of God? Well, we have a sense, right? Everybody has a sense that human beings are not just animals who are smart. Some people deny that, and I have never Even as an atheist, I never went along with that view. I always knew that human beings were somehow special, very special. I didn't know why, I didn't know where it came from, but now I think I do. Science and Christian faith are absolutely not in conflict. I understand that people growing up in faith occasionally will lose it for various reasons, but one of those reasons should never be science, okay? Because science is not anti-Christian, science is not atheistic. Christianity was instrumental in the foundation of science, in the beginning of science. All the original scientists were Christians, and that remains. There's still many, many scientists who are Christians despite the current atmosphere, which is somewhat hostile to Christianity. What I see now happening is that atheists are beginning to deny the reality of science. You find atheists saying, no, the universe didn't have a beginning, it's been there forever. No. They say the DNA is not a code, there's no genetic code, it's not a real code. Wrong. And the reason they're attacking scientific facts, because they are, is because the scientific facts are pointing more and more to what they don't want to accept, which is that this world has a creator. And everything we see is part of the creation, including ourselves. If you are being told that you have to choose between science and your Christian faith, reject that. Whoever told you that is wrong. It's not true. What's true is Christianity.
I used to think that the idea that this all came about by chance, that this life, this planet all came about by chance, I used to believe that. And so I used to believe that DNA self-formed. I build stuff now myself. Things don't just form. Random formations are obvious. DNA is not that. DNA has a structure to it. It has an order to it. Not to repeat myself, but I find it ridiculous now, the idea that it just came together from. You hear the idea of the, a tornado whipping through a junkyard and building a Boeing 747, right? DNA forming on itself is even more ridiculous than that. Part of what I love about being a man of faith now is the hope and the love that you feel, knowing that you are a creation and not an accident. Isn't it so much more empowering to think that you were created rather than just came about through a random lottery, a random cosmic lottery? It really centers you in this position of hope and love, knowing that you were created with intention. The same hope and love that you feel when your parents tell you that they were so excited to have you, when your mom was pregnant with you, how excited, she was to give birth and to meet you and all this. That's that kind of hope and love that I think we need as a species. Thinking of us as accidents and thinking of us as humankind as a plague on the planet, it's not just short-sighted and shallow, but it's also, I think it's kind of dangerous as well. I don't like it. I don't like the accidental theory behind our origins. It just never sat right with me. When you look out at the world, you look at all these people that you interact with, you look at all the moving parts of the world, right? The cars, the buildings, the food, the people you interact with, the means through which you interact with these people, using your brain, using your language. It's just all so complex. How did all this, space travel, air travel, math, science, how did this all just come to be out of random luck? To me, the onus is on the atheists now, not on the people of faith, because I believe that there is a logos behind faith. I think there is an obvious logos behind love. I heard it once, and this is in atheist physics. They say that love is the frequency of the universe, and that's very powerful. And so I did this video because I wanted to spread the idea of hope. And you can have hope as an atheist, but it's like drinking decaf coffee, right? I, for one, prefer my coffee with real caffeine in it. I found hope has so much more potency when it's rooted in real faith.
Who would have the audacity to claim that they believed in God if they examined the way they lived? Who would dare say that? To believe, to believe in a Christian sense, to actually, this is why Nietzsche said there was only ever one Christian, and that was Christ. To have the audacity to claim that means that you live it out fully. And that's an unbearable task in some sense. To be able to accept the structure of existence, the suffering that goes along with it, and the disappointment and the betrayal, and to nonetheless act properly, right? To aim at the good with all your heart, right? To dispense with the malevolence and your desire for destruction and revenge and all of that, and to face things courageously and to tell the truth, to speak the truth and to act it out. That's what it means to believe. That's what it means. It doesn't mean to state it. It means to act it out. And unless you act it out, you should be very careful about claiming it. And so I've never been comfortable saying anything other than I try to act as if God exists, because God only knows what you'd be if you truly believed. I mean, if you think about it in some sense, that's the central idea in Christianity, is that if you were capable of believing, it would be a transfiguring event, a truly transfiguring event. And I know people experience that to one degree or another, but we have no idea what the limit of that is. And we have no idea what the possibility is within each person if they lived a life that was maximally courageous and maximally truthful. You know, because maybe you're running at 60% or 70% or 20% and at cross purposes to yourself. God only knows what you'd be if you believed. And so, well, I try to act like I believe, but I'd never claim that I manage it.
Part of the atheist Dillahunty's argument is that you can be a good person absent of faith, but I would apply the coffee analogy to this as well. You can be a good person as an atheist. You can. It's definitely doable. I did it for many years, but again, it's decaf coffee, right? It's superficial. Here's the thing, looking back, I realized that my whole life I was living as a Christian without even knowing it. You know, I was being good to people. I was behaving well. I was doing what I was supposed to. In retrospect, I was a Christian the whole time. I just didn't think the same way I do now. You know, I just had that atheistic, that linear, that unidimensional mindset that, oh, everything is observable, and oh, everything in the universe, if you can prove it in a lab, then it's real. If you can't, then it's not real. You know, that's scientism, right? That's its own religion. Scientism, I could go on and on about scientism. If you are an atheist, chances are you're actually not an atheist. You're not absent faith. You do have a religion. It's scientism. It's believing in linear evolution and what the science books tell you. So yeah, even as an atheist, I was still a nice person, loving person, but now all that love that I have is solidified with a concrete foundation, and that's faith. I now see the real value in loving people as opposed to just doing it for the sake of going through the motions. My love is genuine. I see a lot of my friends, they turn to faith when they hit hard times, right? They hit rough times, rough patches in their lives. They're desperate. The only thing that they have is to call out to God to help them. But I didn't find faith that way. I didn't find my faith in desperation. I found it through rational thought. That's the other thing I wanted to really hammer home with this video, was I came to the logical conclusion that God is real through rational thought, through study, open-mindedness, and deep contemplation. The truth should never fear being questioned. And so if you disagree with me, I welcome the criticism. I'm happy to take the arrows, because chances are whatever argument you might present, I understand those beliefs. I used to have those beliefs myself. I just don't think that anymore. I think that really the media and the education system and the institutions in one way or another have brainwashed us into thinking that the universe is just some Newtonian linear reality, when in fact, you know, the more that gets confirmed with the UAP phenomenon, the more it starts to question that linear reality that we were taught was the truth. I wanted to just sow some seeds of doubt into the atheist mindset, because I want everybody to have hope and to have that belief that we were put here for a reason, because I think operating on that foundation of faith, that there is a higher meaning to everything we do, makes life so much more rich and puts real value in our actions. When we are just operating based on unidimensional self-serving interests, oh, I want food, oh, I want money, oh, I want this, oh, I want this object. It's like, it's so fleeting. It's so in the moment, giving into your base desires. But then when you start to realize that there is a higher meaning to all this existence around us, it not only gives you the foundation to act properly in the world and the reason to act properly, but it also gives you confidence in knowing that you're here for a reason. My content normally is about boots. This is not what my channel's about, but I wanted to do this video because I wanted to speak to the atheists, and I wanted to speak to the people of faith alike, because I see a lot of fault in both sides of the argument. I wanted to offer my perspective on it because I never saw somebody really link the two together. Whenever I listen to Christian podcasts, they're always operating on the assumption that the people listening are Christians. And whenever I listen to an atheist podcast, they're always operating on the assumption that everybody's an atheist, and they never merge the two. And whenever there is a debate, it's not always a helpful debate. I think that a lot of people have divorced science from religion, and I don't think you should divorce any discipline from another discipline. To me, it's actually kind of ridiculous to divorce two disciplines from one another, because you're gonna stovepipe information from getting in and interacting with the other body of knowledge. Same thing with people of faith who don't want to look into the UAP phenomenon because they want to think that everything in reality is in the Bible. I also don't think that that is true. I think that it could be true that the Bible is both a true account of historical occurrences, but I also don't think that the Bible is comprehensive in that it covers all potential civilizations that could potentially live in the universe. I don't think that being a Christian means you can't believe in other civilizations. We know other civilizations have risen and fallen on Earth. I don't think that it's helpful as people of faith to sort of disregard science, and I don't think it's right for science to disregard faith either. Another big pill to swallow for me was listening to the Joe Rogan podcast where he had Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson on. They confirmed that massive flooding took place between 10 and 12,000 years ago.
20th century heretic J. Harlan Bretz, and his story to me kind of encapsulates the whole process of forcing this paradigm shift. For years, he was out there exploring this evidence that there had been this tremendous flooding in Washington state. All of his critics were dismissive without ever even going out and looking at the evidence firsthand in the field. What he did was he stuck to his guns for 3 decades and continued to amass evidence to the point where they just couldn't dismiss it anymore. And finally, a group of them went out, began to explore the landscapes for themselves. And one of the leaders, James Galouli, who was sort of the leader of the skeptic faction that had set out, their sole purpose was to discredit and lay this whole flood heresy to rest once and for all. But he went out in the field, and they spent about 8 days in the field, where he's seeing this evidence for himself over and over again. James Galouli was honest enough so that after a week out there, they were at a place called Palouse Falls in southern Washington, which was one of these areas where these tremendous inland tsunamis swept across the land. I took a group of people out there and took them to Palouse Falls to show them right on the spot where James Galouli was standing when he finally had his epiphany. See, this flooding stuff relates directly to the idea of the impact, explaining how these parallel lines of evidence are now converging. But the interesting thing about Galouli was that he wandered off by himself for a long time, away from the group, and was standing there looking at this massive cataract with 400-foot cliffs and this little tiny ribbon of water flowing over it and this huge canyon below it and these big boulders. And he had seen, for a whole week, he'd been seeing this stuff. And it finally got to the point where it was undeniable. And he walked back to the group, and the words out of his mouth verbatim were, "How could I have been so wrong?" The flooding phenomena was hijacked and then placed within this more gradualistic context, really to avoid the fact that it was something so anomalous and such a departure from our modern experience that we had to look outside of our modern experience to find an explanation. What they wanted to do was find something within our modern experience, and this is the cornerstone of the uniformitarian approach, is that we look for a modern example and then we extrapolate backwards from that. In the modern world, we have proglacial lakes, that form in front of glaciers, and sometimes these proglacial lakes might be held in by an ice dam or another glacier. These ice dams will give away and they will cause pretty catastrophic flooding. They're very common up in Iceland because you've got several volcanoes under the Icelandic ice sheets. And up there they use the term Jökulhlaups to describe these outburst floods. But here's the thing. When you look at the modern versions of it, you basically are looking at floods that are less than 1/1000th of one single flow from these floods we're talking about that happened, 12 and 13,000 years ago.
1,000th.
Less than 1,000th. Less than 1,000th in peak discharge and in total volume.
And the ego blocks anything that's contrary to what you've already established as fact.
Exactly.
Since we're on the topic of biblical narratives and stories and concepts that I previously thought were false, we might as well address the idea also of giants. Now, this is something, had you brought this up to me 3 or 4 years ago, I would have laughed in your face and called it nonsense and called it fiction and called it myth, but there is a lot of evidence to suggest that giants were real. I'm about to play a clip of some historical accounts that I consider to be quite compelling and quite valid. Consider this for a second. The idea of giants isn't so outlandish, especially when you consider, we know of when you cross-hybridize a lion with a tiger, we get what's called a liger, which is a very large cat. These are two different species that are just close enough that their genomes are close enough matched to where they're able to procreate. Now, one common misconception is that their offspring, the ligers, are infertile. They're sterile. But that's actually not true in all cases. Actually, I believe female ligers are fertile, and then they can go on to then breed with lions or tigers. So this idea of two different similar species coming together and procreating and creating a large offspring is not so outlandish. I didn't used to believe in giants, but there are many accounts of giants in the Bible, and just like the flood myth, this is another narrative that I can no longer discount.
While the Bible speaks of giants roaming the earth in the remote past, so do many other mythologies from around the world, as quoted by the Greek poet Homer in 400 BC, saying, "On the earth there once were giants," or as communicated by Native American tribes, who have a long oral tradition passed down concerning inhabitants with an unusually large demeanor. In fact, it was none other than President Abraham Lincoln who was quoted in 1848 as saying before Congress that, quote, "the eyes of that species of extinct giant, whose bones fill the mounds of America, have gazed on Niagara as our eyes do now." What was this giant species Lincoln spoke of? A race many presume to be of a tall, strong, and intellectually sophisticated people. Well, we know that the ancient American landscape was littered with many ancient burial mounds, and while digging, exploring, or legitimate testing in an anthropological context is forbidden these days, this was not always the case. During the last several centuries, the remains of hundreds of giant humans have been discovered on U.S. soil.
Here was me thinking all this time that the flood myth was just a myth. It's now been all but confirmed. There was very catastrophic flooding that took place between 10 and 12,000 years ago, and even more before that. I'll also leave a link to that if I could find it in the description below, because it's undeniable. Every single civilization on this planet has a flood myth. Why is that? I used to look at the Noah's flood story as, oh, it's just a myth, oh, it's just a fanciful story. But then science is now corroborating it. I don't want to sound too repetitive, but if you're an atheist, I understand why you think what you think. And I don't judge you either. We're all just kind of mindlessly trying to navigate this reality, and we're doing the best we can with the information that we have available to us at any given point. It's very rare for me to hear a story of an atheist becoming a person of faith. I always hear it the other way around, right? And there's many reasons for that. Like I said, the church has a lot of faults, but I think I'm one of the rare people to actually come out of atheism into Christianity with a lot of rational contemplation and thought. If you're an atheist and you have an axe to grind against religion, believe me, I understand. Atheists are not stupid people. I think that they just don't have the full picture. And that's what I wanted to do with this video. And it's because I love you guys, and I want everybody to have the full picture. I want you to have hope. And I want you to know that you are loved and that you are a creation and that you are here of the will of God. And so with that, I'll shut it down. Please, as always, leave me your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear what you all have to say because I'm on this journey as well. And I hope I was able to do this subject some justice. Just to let you know that wherever you're at in your journey, the good news is there's always resources. There's always more information out there. You can continue growing, continue seeking. Please don't just listen to me. Do your own research, do your own contemplation. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If I swayed you in any way, please let me know, because I wanted to really reach the people that were on the fence. I also wanted to bring some level of awareness to people of faith, because they're often judgmental, they're often unfair with the unfaithful, with the atheists, and people on both sides scoff at the other side. I don't know that that's the best approach. I think the best way to move forward is to have that understanding, that middle ground, and not be so judgmental and be loving of the other side, because everybody is at an individual space in their journey. We're all growing. I hope I did this subject some justice, and I hope I gave you something to think about. So anyways, thanks a lot for watching, guys. I'll see y'all in my next video.